This work of fiction explores the darkest betrayal imaginable. When Richard and his mistress plot to drug his wife Elizabeth into a coma after childbirth, they believe their plan is perfect. But they were wrong. The story begins now. Elizabeth Harrington gazed out the bay window of her Chelsea townhouse as evening rain speckled the glass, transforming the manicured garden into a glistening wonderland. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, the child within giving an occasional flutter of movement that still, after 7 months, brought tears to her eyes. The nursery on the second floor was meticulously prepared. Walls painted in soft yellows and greens, furnished with a handcrafted oak crib that had been in her family for generations, restored and gifted by her father. A hand-painted mural of the English countryside adorned one wall, commissioned from an artist Richard had insisted was the only proper choice for their child. In 3 weeks, their family would be complete. Elizabeth traced raindrops with her fingertip against the cold glass, each one racing down like the thoughts that had begun to trouble her these past months. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 7. Richard had promised to be home by 6. Any word from Richard? Margaret, Elizabeth's longtime housekeeper, set down a cup of chamomile tea on the rosewood side table, the china delicately clinking against the saucer. The aroma of honey and lavender wafted upward, comforting and familiar. His meeting must be running late again. Elizabeth's smile didn't reach her eyes, a detail that didn't escape Margaret's notice. 3rd time this week. Margaret nodded, her weathered face revealing nothing, though her pale blue eyes held a flicker of concern. She had served the Harrington family for nearly 2 decades, first for Elizabeth's parents in their Kensington home, and now for the young couple. She had watched Elizabeth grow from a headstrong girl with scraped knees and untamed curls into a composed woman who had married well. Perhaps too well. Richard Harrington came from old money, with estates across England and investment properties throughout London. Their wedding at St. George's in Hanover Square had been the social event of the season 2 years prior, featured in both Tatler and The Times. "I've prepared your evening medication, Mrs. Harrington," Margaret said, placing a small white pill beside the teacup with measured precision. "Dr. Wilson was quite firm about keeping your blood pressure regulated until the birth. He telephoned earlier to check on your condition." Elizabeth nodded gratefully, touching Margaret's work-worn hand briefly. The pregnancy had been difficult, with concerning blood pressure spikes in the 3rd trimester that had led to 2 brief hospitalizations. Richard had insisted on the finest physicians in London, engaging Dr. Wilson, whose client list reportedly included minor royalty. "You're too good to me, Margaret," Elizabeth said softly. "I don't know what I'd do without you, especially now." Margaret's usually stern expression softened. "Nonsense. I've known you since you were toying with your mother's pearls and hiding from your tutors. It's my privilege to see you become a mother yourself." As if summoned by thought, the front door opened with a decisive click, and Richard's voice echoed through the marble foyer, bouncing off the ornate ceiling with its plasterwork medallions. "Elizabeth? Are you home?" "In the sitting room," she called back, straightening in her chair and smoothing her maternity dress, a designer piece in teal silk that Richard had insisted she purchased despite its extravagant price. Richard Harrington strode in, raindrops still clinging to his tailored Seville row overcoat like tiny crystal beads. At 38, he cut an impressive figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with precision-cut dark hair graying at the temples and piercing blue eyes that had first captured Elizabeth's attention across a crowded ballroom at a charity gala for children's hospitals. Those eyes had seemed kind then, full of warmth and promise. "You should be resting," he said, bending to kiss her forehead with cool lips. His cologne carried unfamiliar notes beneath it, something floral and distinctly feminine. Elizabeth felt a tightening in her chest that had nothing to do with her pregnancy complications. "I've been sitting all day," Elizabeth replied, trying to keep her tone light. "The doctor said moderate movement is good for me. A bit of reading, perhaps some gentle walking. I'm not an invalid, Richard." Richard loosened his Hermes tie with an impatient tug. "Margaret, a whiskey, please. The Macallan, not the Glenfiddich." "Right away, sir." Margaret withdrew quietly to the kitchen, her footsteps barely audible on the polished hardwood floors. "How was your meeting?" Elizabeth inquired, taking her medication with a sip of tea that had begun to cool. She watched her husband over the rim of her teacup, noting the slight discoloration on his shirt collar, a smudge of something that might have been lipstick. Productive. Richard settled into the leather armchair opposite her, crossing his legs with practiced ease. We've secured the Liverpool properties. Jenkins was reluctant, but eventually came around to our terms. Once renovations are complete, the return on investment will be substantial, at least 30%. I've already had interest from several restaurant chains looking to lease the ground floor spaces. Elizabeth nodded, familiar with her husband's business ventures, yet increasingly distant from them. Early in their marriage, Richard had discussed every decision with her, valuing her Cambridge education in economics and her insight into market trends. Lately, however, he'd become vague, dismissive of her input, as though her pregnancy had somehow diminished her intellectual capacity along with changing her body. "I thought perhaps we might dine out tomorrow," she suggested, remembering how they had once lingered over meals at their favorite restaurants, talking until the staff began discreetly setting up for breakfast. "It's been weeks since we've been to Claridge's. I thought perhaps the sea base you enjoyed last time." Richard's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle in his jaw flexing beneath the perfectly clean-shaven skin. "I've another dinner meeting tomorrow, darling. The Swedish investors. Perhaps next week. You understand how crucial this period is for the company." Margaret returned with his whiskey in a crystal tumbler, and Richard drained half of it in one swallow, the amber liquid disappearing as quickly as the warmth had begun to fade from their marriage. Elizabeth observed the tremor in his hand, the way his gaze skittered away from hers when she tried to hold it too long. Something had changed between them, a hairline fracture that had appeared months ago and was slowly spreading into a chasm. "Was there anything else you needed, Mrs. Harrington?" Margaret asked, her gaze flicking briefly, perceptively between husband and wife. "No, thank you, Margaret. You might as well retire for the evening," Elizabeth replied with genuine warmth. "You've been on your feet all day." As Margaret left, the silence between Elizabeth and Richard expanded, filled only by the ticking of the clock and the gentle patter of rain against the windows. Once, they would have shared details of their days, laughed over small observations, made plans for weekends and holidays. Now, Richard pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails and messages with studied concentration. "I've been thinking," Elizabeth ventured, desperate to bridge the growing distance. "Perhaps we should consider names for the baby. If it's a girl, I was thinking Charlotte, after my grandmother." Richard looked up, his expression unreadable. "Whatever you prefer, Elizabeth. You've always had a better sense for these things." He finished his whiskey and stood. "I have some documents to review before tomorrow. Don't wait up." He left the sitting room without a backward glance, his footsteps echoing on the stairs as he climbed to his study on the 3rd floor, a room that had increasingly become his sanctuary, door often locked against interruptions. Later that night, as Elizabeth prepared for bed in their master suite, she noticed a long blonde hair on Richard's discarded shirt, which he had carelessly tossed into the laundry hamper. She extracted it carefully, holding it to the light of her bedside lamp. Its golden color was so different from her own chestnut brown, catching the light like a strand of precious metal. With methodical care, she placed it in her jewelry box, nestled beside the growing collection of evidence she had been gathering. A receipt for a woman's bracelet she had never received, a matchbook from a hotel Richard claimed never to have visited, a text message glimpsed accidentally that had spoken of longing and secret meetings. When Richard finally came to bed well past midnight, she pretended to be asleep, listening to the rhythm of his breathing and wondering when exactly he had become a stranger sharing her bed. Elizabeth's labor began on a stormy Tuesday morning in late March, 2 weeks before her due date. Rain lashed against the windows of the private maternity suite at the Portland hospital, where Richard had insisted she deliver. The contractions came with increasing intensity, each one taking her breath away and leaving her trembling in their wake. Margaret had accompanied them to the hospital, maintaining a discreet but reassuring presence in the corner of the suite, while medical staff bustled about with efficient purpose. "Mr. Harrington," the nurse said after checking Elizabeth's progress, "your wife has entered active labor. It won't be long now." Richard nodded, glancing at his Patek Philippe watch with poorly concealed impatience. He had been making calls since their arrival, stepping in and out of the suite with vague explanations about urgent business matters. Now, as Elizabeth entered the most critical phase of labor, he seemed distracted, almost detached from the momentous event unfolding before him. Richard. Elizabeth gasped as another contraction seized her, reaching for his hand. Please stay with me now. Richard took her hand with surprising gentleness, his expression softening momentarily. I'm here, Elizabeth. You're doing beautifully. For a fleeting instant, she glimpsed the man she had fallen in love with, the man who had once looked at her as though she were the center of his universe. The moment passed when his mobile phone vibrated in his pocket. He squeezed her hand before releasing it. I'll just be a moment. One last call to make sure everything's arranged for when you come home. As he stepped outside, Margaret moved to take his place by Elizabeth's side, her steady hand offering what comfort it could. He's nervous in his own way, Mrs. Harrington, she said, though her eyes held a shadow of doubt. The labor progressed rapidly after that, Elizabeth's body seeming to recognize that this child needed to enter the world with urgency. Richard returned just as the midwife announced it was time to begin pushing, his face curiously flushed, as though he had received news of great consequence. Push, Mrs. Harrington. One more time. The midwife's voice seemed to come from far away, as Elizabeth strained with all her remaining strength, feeling as though her body might tear apart at any moment. Richard stood beside her, holding her hand with what appeared to be concern, though his eyes repeatedly darted to his watch and the door, an invisible tether pulling his attention elsewhere. With a final, exhausting effort, Elizabeth delivered their daughter into the world. The infant's indignant cries filled the delivery room, piercing and vital, and for a transcendent moment, nothing else mattered. Not Richard's strange behavior, not the suspicions that had plagued her for months, not the uncertain future that seemed to stretch before her. She's beautiful, Elizabeth whispered as the tiny, red-faced bundle was placed in her arms, wrapped snugly in a soft blanket. The baby had a dusting of dark hair and eyes that, when they briefly opened, revealed a deep blue that mirrored her father's. Charlotte. We'll call her Charlotte Elizabeth, for both her grandmothers. Richard nodded, laying a hand on the baby's head with a strange expression that Elizabeth was too exhausted to interpret fully. Something between wonder and calculation. She's perfect, he said, his voice oddly tight. Margaret had been waiting outside, and was permitted to enter once Elizabeth was settled. The housekeeper's usually stoic demeanor softened visibly as she beheld the infant, her eyes brightening with unshed tears. She has your eyes, Mrs. Harrington, Margaret observed quietly, stroking a gentle finger over Charlotte's velvet-soft cheek. And your stubborn chin. Elizabeth smiled tiredly, the exhaustion of labor crashing over her like a wave. Thank you for everything, Margaret. I don't know how I would have managed these last months without you. The words held deeper meaning than their simple surface, acknowledging the housekeeper's role as confidant and friend during the increasingly troubling period of her marriage. Margaret squeezed her hand, an unspoken understanding passing between them. I'll always be here for you and the little one, Mrs. Harrington. Always. The promise carried the weight of years of loyalty, of secrets kept and trust maintained. Richard excused himself to make some calls, claiming the need to inform family and close friends of Charlotte's arrival. Elizabeth drifted into an exhausted sleep with Charlotte settled in a bassinet beside her hospital bed, the newborn's tiny breaths creating a rhythm that tugged at something primal within her. She didn't see Richard step into the corridor, his face transforming from dutiful new father to tense conspirator as he strode toward the lift. She didn't see him dial a number and wait impatiently for an answer, didn't hear him whisper harshly into the phone. It's done. She's had the baby. We'll begin tonight. Nor did she see the gleam of anticipation in his eyes as he disconnected the call, slipping the phone into his pocket with the practiced ease of a man whose life had become a performance. Elizabeth awoke in her own bedroom 3 days later, disoriented and with a pounding headache that seemed to radiate from the base of her skull outward. The room was dim, heavy curtains drawn against the spring sunlight, casting the elegant furnishings in sepulchral gloom. She attempted to sit up, but her limbs felt leaden, unresponsive to her mind's commands. Richard, she called, her voice emerging as a hoarse whisper. Margaret? The door opened moments later, and Richard entered carrying a glass of water and a small pill cup. His expression was one of perfect concern, almost theatrical in its precision. You're awake, he observed, helping her sit up against the pillows. Dr. Wilson was just here. He's concerned about your recovery. The birth was more challenging than anticipated, and your blood pressure has been alarmingly unstable. Elizabeth struggled to focus on his words through the fog that seemed to envelop her mind. Where's Charlotte? I want to see her. The nurse is with her in the nursery, Richard replied, offering the water and pill. This will help regulate your blood pressure. The doctor was quite insistent that you take it immediately. You need to rest completely, Elizabeth. For Charlotte's sake. Something about his tone, the careful emphasis on the medication, triggered a warning flicker in Elizabeth's mind. But the headache was intensifying, and concern for her daughter overwhelmed all else. She took the pill, swallowing it with a sip of water that tasted strangely bitter. I need to feed her, Elizabeth insisted, even as she felt a new wave of dizziness washing over her. I'm supposed to be breastfeeding. Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. The pediatrician recommended formula for now, given your condition. Don't worry, darling. Everything is being handled perfectly. The nurse is highly qualified. Elizabeth wanted to protest, to demand her child be brought to her, but the room had begun to spin sickeningly. She closed her eyes against the sensation, and when she opened them again, Richard was gone, and the quality of light filtering through the curtains had changed dramatically. Hours had passed in what felt like seconds. When the door opened again, she expected Richard, but instead, a woman she had never seen before entered. Young, perhaps in her late 20s, with a pleasant face and auburn hair tied back severely. She wore a nurse's uniform and carried a clipboard, which she consulted before checking Elizabeth's pulse with cool, efficient fingers. Where is my baby? Elizabeth asked, her words slurring slightly despite her effort to speak clearly. I want to see Charlotte. The nurse, Harriet Mills, according to her identification badge, smiled reassuringly. Mr. Harrington will bring her in shortly for a visit. He's just giving her a bottle now. He's quite the devoted father, isn't he? Not many men of his position would be so hands-on with a newborn. Elizabeth frowned, trying to reconcile this image with the Richard she knew. A man who recoiled from messiness, who valued order and control above all else. Before she could question the nurse further, the door opened again, and Richard entered carrying Charlotte, perfectly swaddled in an expensive cashmere blanket. His expression as he gazed at the infant was one Elizabeth had never seen before, possessive, yet oddly detached, as though Charlotte were a valuable acquisition rather than his child. Look who's here to see Mummy, Richard said, his voice pitched in a tone that sounded rehearsed, artificial. He placed Charlotte carefully in Elizabeth's arms, but remained close, as though ready to reclaim the infant at any moment. Elizabeth gazed down at her daughter, marveling at the perfection of her tiny features, the delicate arch of her eyebrows, the rosebud mouth that worked reflexively as though searching for nourishment. Love swept through her with such intensity that tears filled her eyes, spilling over before she could control them. She's thriving, Richard assured her, misinterpreting her tears. The pediatrician says she's in excellent health, gaining weight right on schedule. Elizabeth nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. She pressed a gentle kiss to Charlotte's forehead, inhaling the intoxicating scent of her newborn. A smell that seemed to bypass her conscious mind and connect directly to some ancient, protective instinct. I believe it's time for your evening medication, Mrs. Harrington, Nurse Mills announced, approaching with another pill and glass of water. Doctor's orders. Elizabeth clutched Charlotte closer. Just a few more minutes with her, please. The nurse looked to Richard, who nodded almost imperceptibly. 5 minutes, then she must take her medication. Dr. Wilson was quite clear about the regimen. Those 5 minutes passed in a haze of love and mounting apprehension, as Elizabeth committed every detail of her daughter to memory. The perfect whirls of her tiny ears, the surprising strength in her miniature fingers as they curled reflexively around Elizabeth's index finger, the flutter of her eyelids as she dozed contentedly in her mother's arms. Too soon, Richard was taking Charlotte from her, ignoring her weak protests, and the nurse was insisting she take the medication that already seemed to be dragging her back into the fog from which she had only partially emerged. Each day that followed repeated this pattern. Elizabeth would wake, disoriented and increasingly desperate to see her daughter, only to be told it wasn't a good time, that Charlotte was sleeping or being bathed or examined by the pediatrician. Each evening, she would be permitted a brief visit, always under Richard's watchful eye, before being administered medication that sent her spiraling back into a twilight state of semi-consciousness. During one such period of lucidity, Elizabeth caught a glimpse of her reflection in the mirror across from her bed and barely recognized herself. Her face was gaunt, her skin sallow, her eyes haunted pools in a face that seemed to have aged years in mere weeks. She pressed the call button beside her bed urgently, and Margaret appeared instead of the nurse, her expression carefully neutral. "Margaret," Elizabeth whispered, beckoning the housekeeper closer. "Something is wrong. The medicine. It's not making me better. I think Richard." The words seemed too monstrous to complete, the accusation too devastating to voice aloud. But Margaret's eyes widened with understanding, then narrowed with a determination that gave Elizabeth a flicker of hope. "I've noticed things aren't right, Mrs. Harrington," Margaret said softly, glancing at the door to ensure they weren't overheard. "The way Mr. Harrington and that nurse whisper together, the visitors he's been receiving when he thinks no one is paying attention." "Visitors?" Elizabeth echoed, struggling to maintain her focus through the persistent fog that clouded her thoughts. "A woman," Margaret confirmed, her lips thinning into a disapproving line. "Blonde, elegant. Comes when he thinks I'm busy in the kitchen or on my half-day off. But I've seen her. Twice now. The blonde hair on Richard's shirt. The unfamiliar perfume. The gradually withdrawn affection. All the pieces began to align into a picture, so terrible Elizabeth's mind rebelled against it. "Help me, Margaret," Elizabeth pleaded, gripping the housekeeper's hand with what little strength she could muster. "I need to see what they're giving me. I need to." The following evening, as Elizabeth lay in a near-comatose state, Richard and Sophia stood at the foot of her bed. "The doctor believes she's suffered a rare complication," Richard explained to the private nurse he'd hired, a discreet woman with financial problems that ensured her complicity. "She may remain in this vegetative state indefinitely." "How tragic," Sophia murmured, failing to sound sincere. "We've prepared a statement for friends and family," Richard continued. "You'll maintain her care regimen exactly as prescribed." Harriet, the new nurse, nodded uncomfortably. "And the baby?" "My colleague Miss Blackwood will assist with the child," Richard replied. "You need only concern yourself with Mrs. Harrington's care." Later that night, as the household slept, Margaret slipped into Elizabeth's room. She had served the Harrington family loyally for years, had watched Elizabeth grow up, had grown suspicious of the rapid deterioration in her condition. With trembling hands, she collected one of the pills Richard had been administering and sealed it in an envelope. The next morning, she made an excuse to leave the house and took the pill to an old friend, a pharmacist who owed her a favor and wouldn't ask questions. 3 days later, Margaret had her answer. The medication contained a powerful sedative in doses, far exceeding any legitimate prescription. Her worst fears confirmed, Margaret faced an impossible choice. Speak out and likely be dismissed without reference, perhaps even implicated, or find another way to help the young woman who had always treated her with kindness. By the 3rd month, the household had settled into a new rhythm. Elizabeth remained in her coma-like state, tended by Harriet and occasionally Margaret. Richard had introduced Sophia as a family friend, helping with baby Charlotte. The staff had their suspicions, but valued their positions too much to voice them. Sophia had effectively taken Elizabeth's place. Though she maintained her own residence, she spent most days and nights at the Harrington house. She wore Elizabeth's clothes, used her cosmetics, played mother to her child. The performance would have been perfect, if not for Margaret's watchful presence. "She's flourishing," Sophia remarked one afternoon as she held Charlotte in the nursery. "Such a clever girl." Richard beamed with genuine pride. "She'll have the best of everything." Neither noticed Harriet standing in the doorway, her expression troubled. The young nurse had grown increasingly uneasy with her role in whatever was happening in this house. She had taken the position out of financial desperation, asking few questions when Richard explained his wife's mysterious condition. But the medications she administered didn't align with any medical condition she'd studied, and Richard's behavior with Sophia was plainly inappropriate. That evening, Harriet found Margaret alone in the kitchen. "Mrs. Pierce," Harriet began hesitantly, using the housekeeper's surname. "May I speak with you about something concerning?" Margaret's weathered face revealed nothing, but she closed the door before responding. "What troubles you, Miss Mills?" "Mrs. Harrington's condition." The medications I've been instructed to give her. Harriet swallowed hard. They don't seem to be treating anything. If anything, they're keeping her sedated. Margaret studied the younger woman carefully, weighing how much to reveal. What would you say if I told you I share your concerns? I'd say I should have spoken up sooner. Harriet's voice strengthened. I've been researching her symptoms privately. This isn't a natural condition. Margaret nodded slowly. No, it isn't. And I believe I know what's happening, but I need help to prove it. As the two women spoke in hushed voices, they formed an unlikely alliance. Margaret explained her suspicions and the evidence she had gathered. Harriet contributed her medical knowledge and access to Elizabeth's care. It will be dangerous, Margaret warned. Mr. Harrington is not a man to cross. Harriet straightened her shoulders. I became a nurse to help people. I won't be part of harming someone, no matter the consequences. That night, they began substituting Elizabeth's medications, gradually reducing the sedative doses while maintaining the appearance of compliance. It would be a long process. Too rapid a change would be noticed, and Elizabeth's system had become dependent on the drugs. Margaret also began documenting everything. Photographs of medication bottles, recordings of conversations between Richard and Sophia, careful notes on Elizabeth's condition. If their efforts failed, this evidence would ensure justice could still be served. 6 months passed in the Grand Chelsea townhouse. Baby Charlotte grew from a newborn into an alert, babbling infant. Richard and Sophia's relationship flourished publicly under the guise of family friend, helping a widower in all but legal terms. Elizabeth remained in her twilight state, though subtle changes had begun to appear. Increased periods of consciousness, more responsive movements, clearer eyes. Margaret and Harriet worked methodically, reducing Elizabeth's medication incrementally while documenting every aspect of her condition. They had created a detailed record of Richard and Sophia's discussions, inadvertent confessions captured when they believed no one was listening. Patience, Margaret counseled when Harriet expressed frustration at their slow progress. We must be certain Elizabeth can recover fully before we expose them. If we move too quickly, Richard could simply replace us and continue his plan. Harriet had grown devoted to Elizabeth's care, reading to her during their private sessions, speaking to her as though she could understand every word. And perhaps she did. Research suggested comatose patients often retain some awareness of their surroundings. Your daughter took her first proper steps today, Harriet told Elizabeth one afternoon as she adjusted her pillows. Charlotte is so determined, just like you must be. Keep fighting, Mrs. Harrington. We're helping you come back. That night, as Harriet administered the carefully altered medication, Elizabeth's hand suddenly grasped her wrist. Her eyes opened, clearer than they had been in months. Help me, Elizabeth whispered, the words slurred but unmistakable. Harriet fought to maintain her composure. We are helping you, Mrs. Harrington. Margaret and I know what's happened. We're bringing you back slowly, so they won't suspect. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. My baby. Charlotte is beautiful and healthy. She's just down the hall. Harriet squeezed her hand. Rest now. When you're stronger, we'll make everything right. The breakthrough accelerated their timeline. Margaret began transferring their evidence to a trusted solicitor, an old family connection who had known Elizabeth since childhood. The solicitor was appropriately horrified and agreed to prepare legal documents for when Elizabeth was strong enough to act. Meanwhile, Richard and Sophia grew increasingly careless in their deception, confident that Elizabeth would never recover. Sophia had all but moved into the master bedroom, and Charlotte had begun to recognize her as a maternal figure. We should discuss making our arrangement more permanent, Richard suggested one evening as they shared a bottle of wine in his study. Perhaps a small ceremony abroad once enough time has passed. Sophia twirled her wine glass thoughtfully. And Elizabeth? Her condition shows no signs of improvement. Eventually, we'll need to consider more permanent care arrangements. Richard's tone left the implication clear. Neither noticed Margaret quietly closing the study door, another damning recording secured on her phone. 9 months after Charlotte's birth, Elizabeth sat upright in bed for the first time without assistance. Her muscles had atrophied somewhat from the extended confinement, but the physical therapy Harriet had secretly conducted during bathing sessions had maintained some tone. It's time, Elizabeth said, her voice stronger than it had been since before Charlotte's birth. I want to see my daughter. I want my life back. Margaret and Harriet exchanged glances. Richard and Sophia are attending a gallery opening tonight, Margaret said. They won't return until late. This may be our best opportunity. With painstaking care, they helped Elizabeth to the nursery, where Charlotte lay sleeping. When Elizabeth saw her daughter for the first time since those early days, now a rosy-cheeked infant with wisps of dark hair like her own, she wept silently. "She's so beautiful," Elizabeth whispered, touching Charlotte's cheek with trembling fingers. "She's grown so much." "She has your temperament," Harriet offered, determined and observant. Elizabeth's expression hardened as she looked up from her daughter. "I want them to pay for this. For trying to take her from me. For trying to erase me." "The solicitor has prepared everything," Margaret assured her. "We have extensive evidence, recordings, the medication analysis, documentation of their relationship while you were incapacitated. But we need to ensure your safety and Charlotte's before we proceed." Elizabeth nodded, resolution replacing grief in her eyes. "Tonight then. Help me prepare." When Richard and Sophia returned from their evening out, the house was quiet as expected. They retired to the master bedroom, slightly intoxicated and oblivious to what awaited them. As Richard switched on the bedroom light, he froze. Elizabeth sat in the armchair by the window, dressed in one of her old silk dressing gowns, hair arranged simply but elegantly. Charlotte slept peacefully in her arms. "Hello, Richard," Elizabeth said calmly. "Surprised to see me awake?" Sophia gasped, clutching Richard's arm. "What is this? How is she? How am I conscious?" Elizabeth finished for her. "It seems your plan wasn't as foolproof as you believed. The medications you've been poisoning me with for the past 9 months have been gradually replaced." Richard recovered his composure quickly, adopting a concerned expression. "Elizabeth, you're confused. You've been very ill." "Save your performances," Elizabeth interrupted. "I know everything. About the affair, about your plan to keep me in a permanent comatose state, about your intentions to eventually ensure I never woke up at all." "These are serious accusations," Richard said coldly. "Clearly your condition has affected your mind. Perhaps you'd like to hear your own words?" Elizabeth nodded to Margaret, who stepped from the shadows and played a recording on her phone. Richard's voice filled the room. "Once the baby is born, we'll begin administering the drug. Her illness will progress naturally until she's essentially vegetative. No one will question it after her difficult pregnancy." The color drained from Richard's face. Sophia stepped away from him, her calculating mind already seeking distance from what was clearly a disastrous situation. "You have exactly one opportunity to handle this with some shred of dignity," Elizabeth continued. "My solicitor has prepared divorce papers, along with a comprehensive settlement. Sign them, and the evidence of your attempted murder goes to my solicitor rather than the police." "You can't prove anything," Richard blustered, though his confidence was visibly crumbling. "Can't I?" Elizabeth nodded to Harriet, who entered with a thick folder. "Medical documentation of inappropriate medication. Recordings of your discussions about keeping me sedated. Testimony from both Margaret and Harriet. The original medication you used, which we've had analyzed by 3 independent laboratories." She met his gaze steadily. "Would you prefer to gamble with a jury, Richard?" The silence stretched between them. Charlotte stirred in Elizabeth's arms, but didn't wake. "What are your terms?" Richard finally asked, defeated. "Full custody of Charlotte. 70% of your assets. Significantly more than the prenuptial agreement stipulated, but considerably less than you'd lose with a criminal conviction. Your London properties and the estate in Hampshire transfer to me. You retain the Liverpool investments and enough to live comfortably, though not extravagantly." Richard's jaw tightened. "And if I refuse?" "Then Detective Inspector Galloway, who is currently waiting downstairs, arrests you both for attempted murder, conspiracy, and fraud." Elizabeth's voice remained steady. "You'd face 15 years minimum. Sophia likely 12 as an accomplice." Sophia's composure finally broke. "This is absurd. I never administered any drugs." "No, but we have lovely recordings of you discussing the plan, selecting the private nurse, and deciding how to handle my long-term care." Elizabeth's smile was cold. "The criminal code doesn't look favorably on conspirators, Ms. Blackwood." Richard reached for the folder containing the divorce papers, his hands visibly shaking. "One last thing," Elizabeth added as he prepared to sign. "You will never contact Charlotte or me again. Your parental rights are terminated completely. As far as my daughter is concerned, you died alongside the man I thought I married." As Richard signed the documents, Elizabeth felt no triumph, only a profound sadness for what might have been and quiet determination for what would come next. 1 year later, Elizabeth stood on the terrace of her Hampshire estate, watching Charlotte toddle across the lawn in pursuit of a butterfly. At nearly 2 years old, her daughter was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, with no memory of the dark events that had marked her early life. "She's fearless, that one," Margaret remarked, joining Elizabeth with a tray of tea. "Like her mother had to become," Elizabeth replied with a small smile. The past year had brought profound changes. Richard had indeed signed the divorce agreement, avoiding criminal charges by the narrowest margin. Last Elizabeth had heard, he had relocated to Berlin, his reputation in London society irreparably damaged by the whispers that inevitably followed such a dramatic separation. Sophia had fared worse. Without Richard's protection, her web of deceptions and manipulations had unraveled quickly. Former associates, sensing weakness, had revealed her history of fraudulent business dealings. She now faced charges unrelated to Elizabeth's case, but stemming from the investigation it had prompted. Harriet had completed her nursing qualifications with Elizabeth's support, and now served as the estate's live-in nurse, though her duties were more those of a family friend than an employee. Her testimony and care had been instrumental in Elizabeth's recovery, both physical and emotional. "The solicitor called this morning," Margaret said, pouring tea. "The last of the property transfers is complete. Everything is officially in your name now." Elizabeth nodded, watching Charlotte's delighted expression as she discovered a row of daisies. "I've been thinking about the London house." "Oh," Margaret raised an eyebrow. "I think I'll sell it. Too many shadows there." Elizabeth sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Besides, I've been considering establishing a foundation. Something to support women recovering from trauma, perhaps with a focus on maternal health." Margaret smiled approvingly. "You'll be brilliant at it." Elizabeth reached over to squeeze the older woman's hand. "I never properly thanked you, you know, for seeing what was happening, for believing in me when I could barely speak, for saving my life." "You were always the daughter I never had," Margaret replied simply. "I couldn't fail you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Charlotte explore her world with unbridled joy. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed Elizabeth had instead revealed unexpected strength and forged unbreakable bonds of loyalty and friendship. Later that evening, as Elizabeth tucked her daughter into bed, Charlotte pointed to the photograph on her nightstand, the only one Elizabeth had kept from before. It showed Elizabeth pregnant, standing in the garden, her face alight with anticipation for the future. "Mama happy?" Charlotte observed sleepily. "Yes, darling." Elizabeth smoothed her daughter's dark curls. "Mama is very happy now." After Charlotte had fallen asleep, Elizabeth retreated to her study, where a manuscript lay open on her desk. She had begun writing her story, not as a sensational tale of betrayal and revenge, but as a testament to friendship, resilience, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people like Margaret and Harriet. The evening news played softly in the background as she worked. A familiar name caught her attention, and she looked up to see Richard's face on the screen. The reporter was discussing financial irregularities in his German investments, the latest in a series of setbacks that had plagued him since leaving England. Elizabeth felt a moment of pity for the man she had once loved, but it passed quickly. She turned off the television and returned to her writing. The past had its place, but her focus remained firmly on the future she was building, for herself, for Charlotte, and for the women her foundation would someday help. Outside, the Hampshire countryside stretched peaceful and serene under a canopy of stars, so different from the London townhouse where betrayal had once festered in every shadow. Here, Elizabeth had found not just recovery but renewal, a life reclaimed and reimagined on her own terms. As midnight approached, she closed her manuscript and walked to the window. In the distance, the lights of the nearest village twinkled like earthbound stars. She was no longer the naive young wife who had trusted too easily, nor was she defined solely by the betrayal that had nearly destroyed her. She had become something more complex and powerful. A survivor, a mother, a woman who had stared into darkness and emerged stronger. Elizabeth Harrington turned from the window and extinguished the lamp, letting moonlight silver the room. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new joys. And she would face them all with the quiet strength she had discovered in herself and the loyalty she had inspired in others. Some betrayals break you. Others reveal what can never be broken. The end.